All good? All right. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this workshop, From Idea to Impact, Understanding Markets and Consumers. And I guess this is a welcome or a welcome back if you've been joining me for the rest of this workshop series. So this is the second in a three-part workshop series. There is no need to attend all of the workshops. They are all sort of standalone workshops, but they are designed to help students who are doing this sort of big picture thinking around problem solving and might have different types of research that you need to engage in order to really get some concrete answers about how to go about creating an effective solution. So I am Rachel Figueredo. I'm Waterloo's entrepreneurship librarian. I've got Amy Lim here as my support today. Amy's been so helpful for this workshop series. And as the entrepreneurship librarian, I do run workshops that talk a lot about sort of the entrepreneurial or startup aspect of research. However, I would say a lot of this workshop is really applicable to anyone, even if you're not planning to start a business. So just keep that in mind as I'm sort of walking through. For today's workshop, Understanding Markets and Consumers, we are going to talk a lot about primary research and secondary research. We're going to talk about that in the context of market research and sort of understanding our target market. And then we're going to use a combination of library research tools and freely available tools today. So the library tool that I want to use is called Statista. It's a statistics portal, and it allows us to search for consumer behaviors, consumer patterns, that sort of thing. And then we can also compare that with Statistics Canada, which is a freely available tool, and it's something that we all have access to regardless of being students or connected to the university in some way. I really do want to showcase a mixture of resources in these workshops, especially because I know that not everybody is going to stay a U Waterloo student forever. At some point, you'll probably graduate. And so I still want to give you that foothold into some good quality information sources that you can use if you're sort of continuing on this work. So for every one of these workshops, I like to have a centralized example, something that we can latch onto as I'm showcasing some of these different research tools. And so for today, I'm going to pretend that I want to come up with a counseling app or some sort of online counseling service. And what I need to do is better understand who my target market would be so that I can effectively position this product towards that target market and I can do the marketing towards them. So that's my research example. We're going to focus on a counseling app and do some research around that topic today. And if you've joined me for these workshops in the past, you'll know that I like a little engagement. I know it's tough when we are, in an online environment, but one of the things that I do like to do is a chat storm. I think it's a great way for me to get a little sense into your existing knowledge around this topic, and then you can also learn from each other a little bit as well. So the way the chat storm works is that I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to put a question on the screen in a second. And then I want you to think about your answer, and you can even start typing into the chat your answer, but I want you to wait before clicking send so that everybody has a chance, maybe 30 seconds or so, to formulate their answer, and then we will all hit send at the same time. So I'm going to ask the question. You guys can use the chat function, which on Zoom is just down at the bottom of your screen. There's sort of the little speech bubble icon. I want you guys to use the chat, but hold off before you actually click enter. So here is our question. I want to start an app or online counseling service, but I'm not sure who to market to. What should I do to find out? So again, take 30 seconds to start thinking about your answer. I want to start an app or online counseling service, but I'm not sure who to market to. What should I do to find out? Okay, if you have an answer for this, you can go ahead and click send. And let's compare our results here. Research who uses counseling services. search on the consulting market first, look online for people who have the problem you're trying to solve. Yeah, this is great. Those are all great answers. So survey, yeah. And this is kind of what I was expecting, was to see a little bit of a difference in terms of our approaches to get started. They're all talking about doing market research. They're all talking about doing that research on our target market, or trying, in this case, even to start figuring out who that is. But what I always find interesting when I talk to people about sort of first steps for market research is that we get into this difference between primary research and secondary research. So I want to spend a minute talking about the difference. So primary research, when we're talking about sort of market research or this kind of, consumer research, is data that you're collecting yourself. So the example that we have of running a survey, that's an example of primary research, because I would create the survey and run the survey and collect really specific answers on my particular topic. That's one of the big benefits of primary research. And one of the reasons that people engage in that so often is because it gives you really specific answers if you have this sort of niche topic, or you're really trying to figure out this target market's personality and try to understand who that person is. The downside of primary research is that it's really time consuming. And if we're not trained in it, it can be one of those skills that we really have to learn a lot about in order to do effectively. So I've got a couple of examples of primary research, surveys being one of them, interviews, and even observations, kind of sitting and taking note of things, which I don't really have an example of for this particular topic, but it could be the case in other topics. So I want to juxtapose that with secondary research, and that's existing data that's been collected by others. So some of the other examples in the chat about like searching somewhere or doing like finding research that already exists, that's an example of secondary research. So we're going out and finding information that's already been published. What you'll find is that if I've got a very specific question, or I've got a very specific population that I'm looking into, the results that I'm going to find through secondary research are probably going to be generalized, because I didn't run that survey. I didn't, ask those particular questions on my mind. So they might not fully answer my research question. However, they can be a good starting point, because oftentimes they're faster. Hopefully, especially after today, you'll have those skills to kind of know where to look or how to get started in this area. And so in that respect, it can be maybe a little more economical as well. The other thing I should mention about running surveys is that sometimes there's another cost associated with, a survey tool that you would have to subscribe to, like SurveyMonkey or something like that. So I want to show you tools that you have access to for the secondary research piece today. We're going to start there, and that's my typical recommendation. Start with secondary research first. So we're kind of starting broad and answering all of the questions that we can find answers to that are already available to us. And then we're going to hone that in. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about where to go for your primary research needs. Okay, one more chat storm. So if I want to do market research, what kinds of information am I looking for? I'm talking about, how to figure out this target market. So this is my chat storm question for you. Again, you can type in the chat, but just pause for a second, and I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to answer this question. If I want to do market research, what kinds of information am I looking for? So you can think of, what do I want to know about my target market? I'll just give you 10 more seconds. This is always my water break time. Okay, go ahead and click enter if you have an answer for this question. Demand, yeah. I would want to know if this is a problem that happens a lot, if there's a solution that already exists, who else has done the same thing, how many people could buy my product, are they able to buy it, is it affordable, the market value, cost, revenue, operating, and logistics. This is excellent, you guys. What sectors of the market are interested in buying it? Yeah. You guys have some really great responses to this. And some of them we're going to talk about today in this workshop that's really around sort of what I call market research in terms of the target market, the consumer perspective. Some of these questions might actually be answerable in next week's workshop on industries and specific company research. So things like competitors and who else might be doing a similar thing to me, we can answer that next week. Today, we're going to focus on the idea of how do we really understand who might be affected by this particular, topic, who might be most interested in buying it, and maybe even starting to think about what would entice them to buy into a counseling app or lean into something like this. So here's where I want to sort of define the market research terminology a little bit. I just did that a little bit here and sort of making the distinction between market research and sort of industry or company research. But when I use that term market research, I think oftentimes it can be used as sort of a blanket term to encompass all of those different topics. What I really want us to use it for is the idea of, our target market, in this case, a particular consumer. So thinking about an individual. So here we would want to understand things like, what's the size of the market? So how many potential customers do I have? Demographics about my target. So things like their age, gender, education level, occupation. What can I better, how can I better understand who this person is? Your psychographics would be things like characteristics about their lifestyle, their personality. Geographics are things like where they live. Behaviors, how do customers shop for products like yours? So do they already have a subscription or are engaged in some kind of online counseling or counseling in a different way? And then trends to better understand, in this case, demographic trends. Are they growing? Are they shrinking? What does this population look like? So this is really from a business to consumer perspective. This is really doing research or thinking from the angle of I want to, position my particular product towards individuals. I do want to spend 1 second saying that you could sort of adapt this concept for a business to business model as well. So instead of thinking about the size of the market as like how many individuals would be potential customers, you might think of that as how many potential businesses would be customers. You could get a sense for, if we're thinking about sort of like the psychographics, that sort of personality, businesses sometimes do have a bit of a personality. Working in a library, I can attest that we are often sort of, slow adopters to change. We do like to be really critical thinkers, but there might be other businesses who are a little less risk adverse. And so, there could be different sort of personalities that you might put onto a particular business. And with a business context, one of the important things to think about is who's actually making the purchasing decisions. So when we are thinking about positioning a particular product or an idea to a target consumer, the consumer themselves, that individual, is usually in charge of making their own financial decisions. However, in a business, it could be a group of people, or maybe you really need to do your work to pinpoint like who is the person in charge of purchasing and how do I win them over or build my case. So from here, we're going to go do some searching, and I want to showcase some of the library tools that you can use to help you along the way. Amy has just put the link in the chat that leads to the same place that this QR code leads to. It's for the Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Commercialization Guide. And I'm going to use that as a jumping off point to get into some particular search tools. So I'll give you guys a second if you do want to open up that guide. If you're the sort of person who likes to sort of follow along and do the searching at the same time as me, you're absolutely welcome to. I will answer specific questions or troubleshooting toward the end of the workshop. But if you are just the sort of person who wants to watch and learn that way, that's fine too. So I'm going to open this up. This is what you should see when you get into the Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Commercialization Guide. And it's really like a landing page in a lot of ways, or a research companion to help you with this kind of work. On the homepage, you're sort of going to get the overview of what this guide is intended to do for you, and you'll have my contact information for later on. But I'm going to hop over to the research tab and scroll down to the market research tab and spend some time there today. Under each one of these research tabs, you'll see that I've tried to include some educational information at the beginning. It's a lot of the stuff that I've actually been talking about already during this workshop. But if you are brand new to doing market research, the idea is that you've got sort of a landing spot or some place that's going to help you understand, what do I mean by that term? What kinds of information are we looking for here? And as you scroll down below that to the actual content on this page or the information sources, we'll see links to, in this case, Statista. That's the first place that we're going to go. So Statista is a really interesting tool that we have available through the university. Amy's put the link in the chat there as well. And the link either from that guide, sort of me showing you from the entrepreneurship guide how to get out to Statista, and the link that Amy's put in the chat are both like the U Waterloo library link to get into this tool. So it's really important for any of our library resources that we're actually using that link to get to these particular search tools. They will authenticate you as library users, and you should see for Statista the little bubble here saying you are using the account of University of Waterloo. So it's just authenticating you as a Waterloo user, and so you're able to get access to this particular tool. Statista is a statistics portal. It has information globally. So there are a lot of different countries represented through here. There's a lot of different research presented through here. Some of it that Statista collects from outside sources, and some of it that Statista collects by doing their own primary or their own research, right? They run their own surveys, and we'll kind of dive into that a little later on as well. One of the good things about Statista, if you've never entered this tool before, is that I think it's the easiest tool that we have available through the library. If you know how to use Google, you know how to use Statista. It's just really simple. So if I was going to search for counseling, you'll notice I'm just using a single search term. I'm not going to bother doing like typing in a sentence or combining different keywords. I think the more simplistic you can be, the better. So I'm going to click search. And the only other thing that I want to do for this particular topic is add a location focus here. So you can see down the right-hand side of the page, we can narrow by different regions. I mentioned that they have a number of different countries represented through here. So as we scroll, you'll see, what information they do hold. But if we click on Canada, it should refresh the page. And now we're going to see statistics about counseling that are available through Statista, all from a Canadian perspective. So I'm going to show you maybe a couple of these just to give you a sense for what kind of information is available through here. And you can imagine that I'm starting with the search term counseling, but for your own searches, if this was your topic, there's probably going to be a couple of different angles that you could come at this from. So you might start with one search term, you might go back and sort of edit your search. I'm going to click open a couple of these. The share of adults in Canada who received mental health counseling seems really useful. Unmet needs for mental health care seems really interesting. There are some like company pieces of information through here as well. So sometimes you're kind of scrolling through and it might not be the most relevant. Again, you can think about ways that you might sort of change your search or filter out your search as you go. So a couple of the results that came up for us, this was percentage of adults in Canada who received mental health counseling or treatment in the past year as of 2020 by province. So we're able to see a percentage of the Canadian population broken down by province here in this lovely little statistic that we can download to save for later. And one of the most important things from all of these results that I'll show you is that they show you the source link. So they give you the information, like where did this information originally come from? So this is from CIHI. I don't remember what that acronym stands for, but it's definitely related to Canadian health statistics. And so it is a reputable source. It's just helpful to know that this information wasn't collected through Statista necessarily, but they are presenting this information in this lovely little format and giving you the link and even the page number on that report for where you can go to find more information. Again, this one is the percentage of Canadians with mood, anxiety, or substance use disorders with unmet needs for mental health care as of 2022. And then this one I did find particularly relevant. The percentage of Canadians who talk to select healthcare professionals about their mental health in the past 12 months by format of care delivery. So here we can see different types of healthcare professionals. And then on the bottom here, it's showing you, the number of people who had spoken to someone in person, telephone, video, or text messaging. So sometimes these results are helpful because they're giving us an indication of, who's using which different types of services, but sometimes they still lead us to have these lingering questions like, number of people are not using mental health care services like psychiatrists or psychologists or counselors through text messaging or video or in some kind of sort of online format. That's not really represented here. And so is it because the services aren't being offered or because the services are being offered, but they're not really a preference for people? So we still have more digging to do. One of the things I did find really interesting is the past two statistics that I just showed you were both from the same report from Statistics Canada. So again, Statista is a really interesting tool because it is linking you to research that is oftentimes freely available elsewhere, but you just might not know to look for this particular thing through Hi or Stats Canada. So I had opened up this report, and what you'll notice is that now we are outside of Statista's platform. We're just taking a look at a report from Statistics Canada. So it's got all of the other data, all of these really interesting charts, but it's also got some more of that text behind it. So we can read through this report and kind of get that context that we might be missing to help understand what else is going on in this particular space. So in this case, it also led me to another portion of the report and another chart here that shows us that, again, putting that sort of lens on or that little hat on where we're trying to think about doing market research, it's telling us that young women were the most likely to have met diagnostic criteria for a mood or anxiety disorder. So here we can see women are represented in the light blue. And for each one of these areas here on the chart, it's repeatedly women who are age 15 to 24 that are struggling with some of these mental health issues. And so this is a really interesting stat for me to start making sense of who could be a potential target population for my research. So this is one way that we can use Statista. We're going to come back to the tool a little bit later on in the workshop, but I do want to show you how we can kind of take that information and start putting it into that market research slide I showed you earlier. So if we've sort of gathered some criteria thinking, okay, these are the different things that I need to know to do effective market research to really understand my target population, we have our first stat here. We have our first sort of data point. We are, in terms of demographics, going to start focusing on women age 15 to 24 in Canada. And so now we can start trying to find more information around that particular population. So in terms of the size of the market, that's the target market we're going to focus on. We can try to figure out what's the size of that market and some of these other psychographics or behavioral information as well. Okay, so we're going to jump from Statista. We are going to return back there in a little bit, but we're going to jump to Statistics Canada next. I mentioned before, and you're probably already aware, that Statistics Canada is freely available. We do have sort of a library access to that, but it doesn't, there's nothing unique or special about this. You can have access to Statistics Canada beyond being associated with the University of Waterloo. So Statistics Canada is Canada's government database of statistics and a lot of key information, both around populations or like individuals, and also sometimes around businesses. So you can find some business statistics through here as well. You can find a mixture of data and data tables, and then different report types like the one that I just pointed you to. And one of the things that I do like to point out is that for any of that sort of population data around particular individuals in Canada, we do have a Canadian census of the population. It's a long survey you fill out about your own household and who lives there. And it's a lot of sort of demographic information about the populations within a household. That data all gets compiled into the Statistics Canada site and is sort of manipulatable by you, by me. And so I want to show you guys a little bit of how to use some of the data tables today, some of the information that they collect through their surveys. But because the census is mandatory, it's a very rich and reliable source of data on Canadian demographics. There are a lot of different tools and things that are available through Statistics Canada. So I wanted to point out a couple. Again, the census is a really rich source of population data. And you can look at that sort of by region. You can sort of manipulate the data tables to be able to fit your research question. There's also a data visualization tool called the Census Program Data Viewer. I often find the easiest way is just to Google search for that, but it is also linked on that research guide I showed you. And then they have data hubs, which are collections of data by a particular topic. So if we were to go on the StatsCan website and click up in the upper left corner where it says subjects, just briefly, I'll show you there are a number of different like subjects or sort of data hubs where they collect a bulk of information about a particular topic. So if you were looking for information on accessibility or on climate change statistics, here I've circled the quality of life hub because that might be relevant for my particular research question. So depending on your research topic, I think it's worthwhile knowing that there are these different like sort of subject categories or hubs where you might find more information on a particular topic. But I'm going to be honest, I sometimes find StatsCan it's just a lot. Like it's just, there's a lot of different tabs across the top. Sometimes it's confusing to know like, where do I go? How do I get into this? So I kind of wanted to show you my cheat today as a starting point. And what I actually do sometimes if I'm looking for how to get into the StatsCan tool and how to find information on my topic. I actually started this. So you'll see I'm doing an in URL search. You can do this in Bing. You can do this in Chrome. I'm sure most browsers, you can do an in URL search. And so what I'm doing is actually taking statscan.gc.ca, the sort of, bare bones of their URL, and doing in URL : statscan.gc.ca. And then you can put a specific search term within quotation marks. So I did start off by searching for counseling, the same search that I did in Statista, and I didn't find anything there. But when I altered my search, and again, you might think about doing this as you're moving through your research tabs here, think about what are different ways that I could describe my topic, or how have I sort of shifted my topic away from counseling toward this mental health area. And here it's led me to a health statistics portal, which is one of their subjects. It's one of their little hubs here. But this is just another way to kind of get into that if you weren't sure where exactly to go. So you'll see down the left side of the page, it says find data on, and then within this health statistics section, it's showing me a number of different places that I could go. If I wanted to find health related statistics about environmental factors or healthcare services. The healthcare services one could be really interesting to go into, but today I want to focus on the mental health and well-being one and continue this focus on my consumers. So there are a number of different results that pop up, 347 different results that StatsCan has collected and sort of decided all relate to mental health. I'm going to continue to focus my results here a little bit. I was going to say search, but I'm not actually going to search for anything. I'm just kind of going to work within what information is available on the page. So as I scroll down, I'm going to narrow to mental health care. And so it's changed my results. I've got 29 results instead of 300 something. I also want to see if I can narrow by data tables. And that's just a particular preference today because I really wanted to show you guys how to use some of these StatsCan data tables. So there's no real reason why you necessarily need to look for that type of information, but I wanted to be able to showcase it today because they can be really rich sources of data. So I'm going to open up this one called mental health indicators. Again, we're going into StatsCan because I know that they have a lot of data on populations, and because we've done this search for the in URL mental health and kind of wandered this way, now we can focus on finding mental health care information about Canadian populations. So that's what we're seeing here. Essentially, StatsCan has run a survey where they have asked participants a number of questions around mental health indicators. So things like, have you ever had any selected disorder, mental or substance? And so they give these little descriptions here. And oftentimes what you'll see is that there's two results that look very similar. So one is asking, have you ever experienced this in the course of your life? And the other one, have you experienced it within the past 12 months? So that's why you'll see a lot of things that are sort of looking like repeated results here. The indicators section, those are telling us, like, those are the questions people have filled out on the survey. And then what we can see are the number of respondents over time through the rest of this survey. So we're looking at information for Canada in total. We are looking at the total number of respondents for anyone who's 15 years or over and for either gender. But we remember from the Statista search before that actually that's not our target population. We kind of wanted to find information on women between the ages of 15 and 24. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do, how to sort of take this table and customize it a little bit. Within StatsCan, wherever you've got these data tables, you can click to add or remove data. And then it will give you a selection of a number of different parameters that you can play around with. So the default here was Canada. Because we're in Ontario, I might just add that to my search. And so under each one of these tabs, wherever we're going to customize something, I'm going to make my selections and then click apply. So now if we scroll down, we should see a comparison between Canada and Ontario. And so I'm going to keep editing my results. I wanted to focus not on the total population, but just on 15 to 24-year-olds. I want to focus the gender not on everyone, but just on women. And then I'm going to change the indicators here. I showed you a little glimpse of those indicators, but I mean, as I scroll down here, you can see there are quite a few different indicators. The list keeps going on, and I'm not interested in all of them. So what I'm going to do is scroll down, recognizing that I have taken a look at these results before. And for you guys, if you're engaging in these data tables for the first time, you're probably going to take a little bit of extra time to sort of see what categories are they including, what questions are being answered here. But they have a series of questions around, perceived mental health. So an individual thinking about, what do I think my mental health state is? Is it very good or excellent? Is it good or fair or poor? So maybe I'm interested in understanding, perceived mental health. And then this other question here around my perceived need for mental health care and whether or not your needs were actually met. I'm deliberately only going to choose a couple of these indicators, a couple of these sort of survey questions, because the tables can get very complex really quickly. And there were a lot of really specific things that I don't think are going to be relevant at this point in time for my market research. But I'll scroll down and I'll show you how our table looks now. So I've only asked for 3 different responses, 3 different sort of indicators here. Oh, I think I want to do one more thing with my data table. Sometimes you can play around with how much information, if you're seeing the number of the population and the percentage of the population. basically you can clean it up a little bit if you're just looking at too many numbers. What I'll see here, though, if I'm taking a look at things like the perceived mental health and people who indicated that it's in that sort of fair or poor category, when people were responding to that question in 2012 across Canada, we were seeing 222,760. And that number's pretty drastically increased now when people responded in 2022. We can also see things like the perceived need for mental health care and people who think that their mental health care needs are not being met. This is for Ontario. In 2012, that number was 31,000. And now in 2022, it's more like 86,000. So this indicates to me that there is a large portion of the population, even just in Ontario, that thinks that their mental health care needs are not being met. So in terms of some of the questions you guys were asking in the chat before, some of the things that you want to find out when you're doing market research, to me, this says, okay, there is a need for a counseling app or mental health care service, or in some way providing access to this unmet need, right? So we're kind of getting a sense for, is there appetite for this particular topic? There are a lot of different ways you could play around with this data table. You could also go, you could compare by different provinces and territories if you were interested to do so. That might help you figure out the geography. You could do things like move away from this particular data table around mental health, and then we could just look at the Canadian census and start trying to figure out, well, how many women aged 15 to 24 are in whichever province or territory might be the most affected. So there are lots of different ways you could keep moving through StatsCan data, but I want to actually sort of hop back over to our slides and show you how I am filling out this chart with the information that we found. So again, one of the things that I've asked is the size of the market. So we have some rough numbers we can go off of here. We've got 86,300 women in Ontario with perceived mental health care needs not being met. That doesn't tell me necessarily that those women are all going to buy into some sort of counseling app, but it tells me that there is a population that's being underserved and maybe still needs some help or support in this area. And then I can also tell that the numbers are growing in terms of the mental health care needs not being met. Again, I might take this one step further and go find some census population data around, are the actual numbers of 15 to 24-year-old women growing or shrinking? What does that population look like? In the slides, which you guys will get after the workshop, I did include that little in URL example because I do think it's pretty helpful as a way to sort of get into StatsCan. But the last thing that I wanted to show you is actually back in Statista. So I know I'm doing a little bit of like hopping back and forth here. Statista is such an interesting search tool, and we used it just in its most basic way to get started. So when we were in Statista, I just used a really simple search and then was looking to see what other statistics they had that might be relevant to my topic. If we go back to the Statista homepage, you'll see across the top these different tabs. And rather than just doing a simple search, I want to spend our last few minutes showing you how you can use the data tables within Statista to understand the consumer perspective a little bit more, because a lot of the information that we've been finding is sort of like census or population data, but we still have some remaining questions around like behaviors or psychographics or characteristics like that. So we might be able to answer them in the Consumer Insights tool. So Statista runs their own survey, and rather than, StatsCan, this tool it's global data. So they do have information globally, and it's more focused in this case on consumers. So we're thinking about particular consumer products or consumer attitudes, which is really interesting. So again, when we're thinking about running our own market research, It's really helpful to do some of this secondary research first to sort of get as much information as you can that's already available, and then really like hone in afterwards on the questions that you can't answer with a tool like this. One thing to note is that Statista runs this consumer insight survey in a number of different countries, but they don't always ask the same questions. So unfortunately, we can't just do like a global filter. We have to choose a particular country. And so I'm going to go back to Canada and just focus on our country. At the bottom here, it tells you the population, so the number of respondents. They've got about 12,000 respondents to this survey. And so it is really like a sample size. It's not, a full Canadian, census survey. So it's just an approximation of the population. And then the other thing you should note, I guess two other things. One is that, of course, everyone who's answering these survey questions is an internet user because they had to use the internet in order to answer this. And they only collect information from Canadian adults between 18 and 64 years old. So just keep that in mind. Now we can get into taking a look at some demographic data as a starting point. Because again, we have those parameters that we know for this particular question. We want to find women age sort of, in this case, it's not 15 to 24, it'll be like 18 to 24. But I'll click on this left-hand side to sort of open up these different categories here. And I'm going to start with the little plus sign just by adding in the gender category. So as I click those little plus signs and just add in data to my tables, here what I'm seeing is just of those 12,000 respondents, how many were female, how many were male, and just sort of getting some basic demographic data. We might click to add the 5-year age brackets as well. So every time I click the little plus sign, it's going to add something to the center of my screen here. And so now I can also get a sense for, how many people within that population range, how many people are represented from this survey based on the broader results. So the demographic data is interesting, but you'll see a lot of these different categories here that are sort of beyond that demographic data, and they might help us answer some of our particular questions. You could better understand things like hobbies and interests, education and employment. We could start really trying to get into, this particular population and what more can I know about their values and attitudes, their fashion, I don't know, whatever else it is that's really like of particular interest to you. For our topic, I'm going to open up the health category and scroll down. There's a number of things like the number of sick days taken, health conditions, but they do have one on mental health conditions that might be relevant to us for this particular topic. So I will click the plus sign to add that. And then even under eHealth, we can see things like health app usage by type. So those might be interesting to take a look at as well. And so again, we're going to get a sense for like of the total number of respondents who uses different health apps. There's lots more that we could do with this particular topic. There's things like social media. We might be interested to understand social media usage by different brands, social media activities, that kind of thing. But where these data tables get really interesting is up at the top here. I'm scrolling back up to the top of my results section, and you'll see that every time I clicked the plus sign, any of those little indicators popped up here underneath this category called rows. So we're just seeing rows of data here. But what I can do, especially with that demographic data, is pull that up to the columns section. And now we can see our data sort of like overlap. So as I scroll down, now I'm able to take a look. Oh, and maybe again, I'll do that one thing under customize your data view. This is just a little note. You can also change how much of the information you're seeing. Again, sometimes it's too many numbers for me. So, all right, if we want to take a look, mental health condition, and so we're trying to understand who's living with mental health conditions or not living with mental health conditions. Now we're seeing not just the number of respondents, but we can break that down by gender. So now we can see men and women. So how many women of that population sample are living with mental health conditions? 38% compared to men at 25%. And we can see the total age brackets. So we can take a look to see within that 18 to 19 year category, who's living with mental health conditions or not. And again, it's sort of lumping it in those 5-year categories, but recognizing that it doesn't collect data on 15, 16, and 17-year-olds for this example. It might also be interesting to see health app usage. So again, here I can see it based on males versus females. So yes, I have used health apps for free, or yes, I have used paid health apps. So the difference there is really interesting. 38% of women have used a free health app, but only 7% have actually paid for a health app. And so again, we might take a look over here under the 5-year age brackets and see many more people have used in the sort of 18 to 19 or 20 to 24 category have used health apps for free versus actually paying for them. This information is really helpful if I'm actually thinking about business models, right? And trying to figure out not just what I'm going to create, but how I'm going to attract users and how likely are they to actually be interested in whatever I have in terms of like how interested are they with their money? Would they actually commit to a particular counseling app? Or I don't know, am I going to have to rethink payment models or what this sort of looks like here? So there's a lot of information I just threw at you. I will say, again, you're going to get the slides afterwards with screenshots of how to go into the Consumer Insights tool and do your own editing and your own exploring within that tool to see how you can kind of manipulate that consumer-based data and fill in some of the answers that might still be lingering with these particular questions. Things like, psychographics. One thing I did find earlier was that for that age bracket, we're looking at mostly Instagram and TikTok users. And then again, that behavioral piece about few people paying for health apps is really interesting. And it gives me something to sort of latch on to, especially as I think about positioning towards primary research and getting to know my users from a different perspective and trying to understand like what would entice them to potentially pay for something like this. So you can see how we've used this slide, this market research slide, as a starting off point or sort of like a landing page for us to keep coming back to over and over again as we're doing our research, just to make sure that there are no gaps remaining, right? That we are doing some broad research across a couple of different tools to really understand our users as best as possible with the information out there. Okay, so we've done some research. In terms of like secondary research, we have tried to find as much information as we possibly can, but presumably you're still going to have to do some primary research. And so I wanted to give you some starting points, some ideas for where to go next. There are a couple of different tools that are either available through the library or through the university. These top two here, one is called Sage Research Methods, and the other one is LinkedIn Learning. And I wanted to point both of these out because they are both great tools to help you learn how to do primary research. So if you've never done like a survey before for a consumer perspective, or it doesn't have to be a consumer perspective. If you've never done a survey before, or you want to learn best practices, or you want interview templates to help you figure out like, what would it look like to run through an interview? Sage Research Methods is really great. It is literally a tool all about research methods. So you can type in survey or market research, and you can find book chapters, you can find video content, you can find lots of different things that is sort of like a learning resource to better understand primary research. LinkedIn Learning is provided through the University of Waterloo. And you might be familiar that LinkedIn Learning has lots of different sort of modules and short courses to help you learn about different topics. You can search for things like market research or your survey, and it would help you learn about, again, how to do this kind of work or how to run those sorts of things. And then the last thing I'll mention is the Statistical Consulting and Survey Research Unit. This is a department at University of Waterloo, And they do a couple of different things. They can help with data analyzation, usually for a fee, but the survey research unit offers all students 1 free hour worth of services there. So I often talk to students about how beneficial it would be to make use of their services if you've done your secondary research and then you're trying to think about your primary research and potentially running a survey or conducting some interviews. So you can formulate your survey, you can kind of come up with all of your questions and then use your free hour to talk to someone about how you formulated the questions, how they sort of flow together, and if they're really going to answer the questions that you have in mind. So that's really their specialization, and I think it's an excellent service that you might want to look into. All right, so today we talked about primary versus secondary research. We use Statista in a couple of different ways to really understand consumer perspectives, and then we dove into Statistics Canada to find demographic and some geographic data as well. We covered a lot in this workshop, so if you're still with me, thank you for being here. I do always leave a slide with a number of different resources, links to everything that I touched on today, tutorials for things that might be relevant to what we talked about, and again, those primary research tools linked at the end. I'll finish off by saying you can always contact me if the generalized example I've been giving in the workshop doesn't meet your more specific needs. I'm always happy to meet with students, faculty, staff, whomever, to sort of talk about what might be really specific or relevant to you. And lastly, today we were focusing on markets. We were focusing on that sort of consumer perspective. But if you were really interested in the industry or company perspective, that's going to be the focus of our last workshop in the series. So if you are interested, I hope you'll join me next week for investigating industries and companies. Amy, do you want to go ahead and stop the recording?